My husband left me at 74 for a 36-year-old woman. You're old and sick, he said. Just smirked. He had no idea what I had already done 2 years before. Hello, dear friends. This is Eleanor, and I am so glad you found your way here today. Please give this video a like and stay with me until the very end. And tell me in the comments what town or city you are listening from. I love knowing how far these words travel. Now let me tell you something. People always want to know what the moment felt like. They picture something loud. Slammed door. Thrown plate. A voice cracking in the middle of the night. But the real moment, the one that changed everything, came on a quiet Wednesday morning in late September. I was sitting in my sunroom in Hendersonville, North Carolina, drinking my second cup of tea, watching the bird feeder outside the window, when my husband of 46 years walked through the room without saying a single word to me. Not good morning. Not a glance. Nothing. Just walked through like I was a lamp. And something in me went very still. Raymond and I had made a life together that was, by most measures, a good one. I want you to know that before we go any further. I had spent 28 years as a reference librarian at the county library, a job I loved with my whole heart. Raymond had owned and operated a small printing company that served local businesses throughout the region. We had raised 3 children in our house on Blue Ridge Avenue, a wide cream-colored house with black shutters and a deep front yard full of old oak trees. We had weathered things together, hard things, and I believed that counted for something. The first thing that changed was his schedule. Raymond had always been a man of firm routine. Dinner at 6, the news at 7, bed by 10. But around the time the dogwoods bloomed that spring, he started coming home later. An hour. Then 2. He said it was a new contract, a big client who needed hand-holding. I believed him because I had always believed him. That was the architecture of our marriage. He spoke and I trusted. It did not occur to me yet that this was not a virtue but a vulnerability I had never examined closely enough. By June he had new clothes. Not the practical kind. Not the sensible shirts and khaki trousers he had worn for decades. These were different. Fitted. Younger somehow. I found a receipt in his jacket pocket when I was sorting laundry. A restaurant I had never heard of. Dinner for 2. Tuesday. He had told me that Tuesday he worked late at the plant. I set the receipt on the kitchen counter and looked at it for a long time. Then I folded it carefully, put it in the small ceramic bowl on my dresser where I kept things I was not yet ready to decide what to do with. I did not bring it up. I know some people would find that hard to understand. But I had spent nearly 5 decades watching how Raymond responded to being challenged without proof. He was a man who could make you feel you had imagined things. He had a particular way of looking at you, patient and a little disappointed, as though you were making a scene over nothing. And afterward you would find yourself apologizing for being worried. I had learned that lesson more than once. So I waited. I began watching more carefully than I ever had in all our years together. Our son David came home in July with his family from Charlotte. I watched Raymond at the backyard cookout, laughing with the grandchildren, flipping burgers, telling the same old stories about the early days of the print shop. And then I watched him excuse himself to take a phone call and stand at the far edge of the yard near the fence, turned slightly away, speaking quietly for nearly 10 minutes. When he came back he said it was a supplier. Our youngest grandchild, 4-year-old Poppy, tugged his sleeve and asked him to push her on the swing. He did. He was not a monster. That was the complicated part. It was August when I decided to look at the bank account. Not because I suspected theft. Because I needed to understand the shape of what was happening. Raymond had always managed our finances. Not out of any controlling intention, or so I had thought, simply because he was better with numbers and I had been glad to let him. But that August afternoon, sitting at the small desk in the corner of our bedroom, I logged into the joint account for the first time in years. What I found was not dramatic. It was quiet and steady and unmistakable. Small withdrawals. Regular. Every week for nearly 18 months. I did not panic. I printed the statements going back 2 years and placed them in a manila folder at the back of my filing cabinet behind the tax records. Then I called my friend Constance, who had gone through her own divorce 11 years earlier and had come out the other side with her dignity and her finances intact. We met for coffee the next morning at the little bakery on Main Street. I told her what I had found. She looked at me steadily and said, "Eleanor, before you do anything else, you need to talk to someone who knows what they are doing." She gave me a name. The attorney's name was Linda Voss. Her office was in a converted house on Marymount Avenue, and she had a calm, organized way about her that immediately put me at ease. I sat across from her desk and laid out what I knew. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked me several precise questions. Then she said something I wrote down in my notebook and have kept to this day. She said, "The best thing you can do right now is not to react. It is to prepare." I drove home that afternoon with a feeling I could not quite name. Something between sorrow and clarity. That fall I moved slowly and quietly. Linda connected me with a financial planner named George Hadley who specialized in exactly these situations. Together the three of us began building a picture of our full marital estate. Raymond had no idea. He was busy, distracted, confident in the way men sometimes are when they believe the person across from them is simply waiting for whatever they decide. I had always been quiet. He took that for passivity. It was not passivity. It never had been. It was simply that I had been directing my attention elsewhere, and had not yet chosen to direct it at him. I will tell you what I did over those months without dramatizing it because it does not need drama. It was paperwork. It was patience. It was sitting with Linda and George and asking questions and writing things down and learning more about my own financial life in 6 months than I had learned in 46 years of marriage. Every account, every asset, every policy. I organized everything the way I had once organized the reference section of that library. By category, by date, by importance. By the time Raymond sat down across from me at our kitchen table the following March, I was ready. He folded his hands on the table. He had always done that when he had made up his mind about something. "Eleanor," he said. He used my full name. That was how I knew. "I would like a divorce," he said. He said it flatly, like he was telling me about a change in the weather. I looked at him. I looked at the man I had made a home with for 46 years, who had held my hand in the hospital when we lost our second pregnancy, who had danced with me at David's wedding in the backyard of this very house on a warm June evening 9 years ago. "I've been seeing someone," he said. "Her name is Melissa. She is 36. He said it with a kind of careful steadiness, as if the steadiness made it gentler. Did not. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked the same question I imagine most women ask. "How long?" 14 months, he said. 14 months. While I had been tending the garden and making Sunday dinners and driving myself to my own doctor appointments because he was always busy. 14 months. And then he said the thing. The thing he must have been preparing, must have rehearsed somewhere privately, because it came out too smooth. He looked at me across the kitchen table where we had eaten 10,000 meals together, and he said, "Eleanor, you're old and you're sick. I need to live the rest of my life while I still can." I had been diagnosed with a thyroid condition 2 years earlier. It was managed. It was not debilitating. It had slowed me down on some mornings and I had adjusted accordingly. But he had been keeping that sentence somewhere, I understood now. Storing it up like a stone to throw at exactly the right moment to make me feel small enough to simply accept whatever came next. I looked at him for a long time. And then I smiled. Not a performance. A real smile, quiet and private. The kind that comes from somewhere deep down when you realize that the thing you feared has arrived and you are still standing. He saw the smile and it confused him. He had expected tears, I think. Or argument. Or the careful, wounded silence he could navigate his way around. He did not know what to do with calm. He did not know what I had spent the last 2 years doing while he was busy being certain I had no options. He left the kitchen. I stayed. I made a fresh cup of tea. I sat at that table as the afternoon light moved across the floor and the yard outside turned from gold to gray, and I let myself feel what was real. Because grief was real. I will not pretend otherwise. 46 years is not a small thing to grieve, and I did not try to skip past it or dress it up as something it was not. I let it sit with me there at that table. The years came back to me like something I was slowly reading through for the last time, page by page, careful and honest. I thought about the first apartment we shared in Asheville, so small the kitchen table touched both walls. I thought about the 3 babies we brought home from the hospital, the particular weight of each one. I thought about the summer of 2001 when Raymond's print shop nearly went under, and we sat together at this very table for weeks going over numbers, and I had stayed steady for him. I thought about my mother's last days and Raymond sitting beside me in the hospital hallway, not saying anything, just being there. That had been real. I was not wrong to have loved it. But I also thought about the receipt in the jacket pocket. The cash withdrawals running back 18 months in neat little rows on the printed statements still sitting in my filing cabinet. The new shirts. The turned back at the fence during Poppy's birthday cookout. The 14 months he had just admitted to so smoothly. And I understood something I think I had been slowly understanding for a while. The man who had sat with me in that hospital hallway and the man who had just called me old and sick at this kitchen table were the same man. People carry both things. You have to deal with what is real. The next morning I called Linda Voss. I had already spoken with her 4 times in the past several months, but this call was different. This call was the beginning of the formal proceedings, and we both knew it. She was direct and calm as always. She walked me through what to expect. Timeline. Process. What Raymond's attorney would likely argue. What our documentation could counter. Had my folder. I had George Hadley's full assessment of the marital estate. I had the printed bank statements. I had the receipts I had quietly collected. I was not walking in empty-handed. Raymond moved out in April. He went to stay, he said, with a friend from the print shop. I learned later from our son David, who was navigating all of this with tremendous grace, that Raymond had in fact moved into an apartment on the south side of town. A new apartment. Furnished. Not the apartment of a man planning to come back. He took his clothes, his tools from the garage, and the television from the den. He left everything else. I stood in the den the evening he drove away, looking at the pale rectangle on the wall where the television had been, and felt something unexpected. The house felt different without him in it. I want to be honest about that. It was not simply a relief, though relief was there. It was also a strange new quiet that took some getting used to. There were mornings in that first month when I came downstairs and felt the absence of him like a physical thing. Not because I wanted him back, but because 46 years of a person's presence leaves a shape in the air of a house and it takes time for that shape to settle into something new. I gave myself the time. I did not try to rush the settling. Linda filed the formal petition in early May. Raymond retained an attorney named Curtis Webb, a tall man I had never met but whose professional reputation Linda knew well. She was not concerned. She had seen his approach before, she told me, and we were well prepared for it. What Webb did not know, and what Raymond certainly did not know, was the full extent of the documentation I had assembled. The financial picture Linda and George had built over the preceding months was thorough in a way I do not think Raymond would have believed me capable of if someone had told him. He had always assumed, I think, that I was not paying attention to the money. This was not entirely his fault. I had allowed it. I had been content for decades to let him handle that side of things while I ran the household and raised the children and worked my library job and tended my garden. Had not seemed like a problem then. Had seemed like a reasonable division. But it meant that when things began to change, when I started to feel the shift beneath the surface of our days, I had to work very hard in a very short time to learn what I should have known all along. George Hadley was patient with me. I want to say that clearly because it mattered. He did not make me feel foolish for not knowing things. He sat with me for hours over several months and walked me through every account, every investment, every pension, every insurance policy, every debt. He showed me what was mine by right and what was ours jointly and what Raymond had been characterizing as his alone. The picture that emerged was significantly different from the one Raymond would have preferred I believe in. And I wrote all of it down in my careful library handwriting in a blue spiral notebook. Raymond's first formal settlement offer came in June. Linda called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was weeding the vegetable garden, and I came inside and sat at the kitchen table with my garden gloves still on and listened. His offer was, in Linda's precise and measured words, not reflective of an equitable division. He was proposing to give me the car, a monthly payment that would cover my basic expenses but nothing more, and a buyout of my share of the house at a figure significantly below what the house would sell for on the open market. He planned to keep the house himself. I set my garden gloves on the table. "What are our options?" I asked. Linda laid them out clearly. We could counter. We could go to mediation. We could take it to court. "What does the documentation support?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone choosing their words with care. "Eleanor," she said, "the documentation supports a substantially different outcome." I nodded even though she could not see me. "Then let's respond appropriately," I said. She said she would have a counter-proposal drafted by the end of the week. I went back to the garden. The summer was strange and full and quiet all at once. I kept my routines because they were mine and they helped me. I walked every morning 2 miles through the neighborhood and along the greenway by the creek. I tended the garden. I kept up my weekly visits to the library, not to work but simply to sit among the books and the familiar smell of old paper, which had always steadied me. I had coffee with Constance every Thursday. I started a watercolor class on Tuesday afternoons at the Community Arts Center, something I had wanted to do for years and somehow never made time for. The watercolor class turned out to be one of the best decisions I made that whole year. There were 9 of us in a bright room overlooking the courtyard, ranging in age from about 30 to well past 80. Our instructor was a small, energetic woman named Patrice who had zero patience for anyone who said they were not creative. "You are all creative," she would say, walking between the easels. "You have just been told otherwise by people who were wrong." I liked her enormously. The class gave me 2 hours every Tuesday that belonged entirely to nothing except color and light and the particular piece of paying close attention to something beautiful. Raymond's attorney made a second offer in August. It was better than the first but still not what Linda considered appropriate given the full picture of our marital estate. There were now additional complications in the documentation. George had identified what he described, carefully and technically, as a pattern of marital fund dissipation over the preceding 14 months that corresponded precisely with the timeline of Raymond's relationship with Melissa. The cash withdrawals I had first noticed in the bank statements had a destination, and that destination was documented. Curtis Webb did not yet know the full extent of what we held. I want to pause here and tell you something about this period because I think it is the part people misunderstand when they hear a story like mine. They hear the word strategy and they imagine coldness. They imagine a woman sharpening herself into something hard and calculating, cutting off her feelings in order to win. That was not what this was. I cried more that summer than I had cried in decades. Some mornings I sat at the kitchen table with my tea, and the grief simply arrived and I let it. 46 years. My children's childhood. My whole adult life built alongside this man. What I was doing with Linda and George was not the absence of grief. It was the presence of self-respect alongside it. It was saying, yes, this is devastating, and also I am not going to walk away from my own life with nothing because he decided I was no longer worth his full attention. Those two things lived together in me all that summer. The sorrow and the steadiness. I think that is actually how it works for most people who come through something like this intact. You do not have to choose between feeling it and handling it. You can do both at the same time. My daughter Patricia called every Sunday evening from Portland without fail. She was careful and loving and occasionally furious on my behalf, which I appreciated. She wanted to come stay with me and I told her to wait, that I was all right, that I was being very well looked after, that she should stay where she was and take care of her own family and that I would tell her when I needed her. She accepted this with some reluctance. Our son David, who lived closer, came twice a month for Sunday dinner, and we talked about everything except the legal proceedings because I did not want my children carrying that weight. What I did want, and what I was very deliberate about, was not being alone in a way that caved in on itself. I had watched women go through loss and fold inward, losing themselves in the emptiness, and I understood the pull of it. It is easier in some ways to disappear into grief than to keep showing up for your own life. But I had spent too many good years building this particular life, and I was not interested in abandoning it. So I kept showing up. The walks, the garden, the watercolor class, the coffee with Constance, the library. These were not distractions. They were evidence. September brought a new development. Linda called on a Thursday morning while I was at my kitchen desk, sorting through correspondence, and told me that Raymond's attorney had requested a meeting. Not a formal mediation but a preliminary conversation between the four of us, the attorneys and Raymond and me. She asked how I felt about it. I told her I was willing if she thought it was worthwhile. She was cautious but said it could be useful to take the temperature of their position before we went any further down the formal path. We scheduled it for the following Tuesday at Linda's office. I arrived 10 minutes early, which is how I always arrive. I wore a gray wool suit I had bought years ago for library board presentations. Well made, simple, not trying to prove anything. I sat down at the conference table and arranged my folder in front of me. Raymond came in with Webb 3 minutes after the hour. He looked, I thought, tired, thinner. There was something slightly diminished about him that I had not expected and that I did not take pleasure in. He sat across the table and we looked at each other for a moment. 46 years between us like weather. Webb opened by suggesting that both parties had an interest in resolving the matter efficiently, and that his client was prepared to be reasonable. Linda thanked him pleasantly and said she was glad to hear it. Then she opened her folder and began to lay out, calmly and precisely, the full scope of what we had documented. The complete marital estate as George Hadley had assessed it. The dissipation pattern. The cash withdrawals and their timeline, and their correlation with Melissa's confirmed presence in Raymond's life during that period. Raymond sat very still. Webb made a note on his legal pad, and his expression did not change, but something shifted in the room. There was a long silence when Linda finished. Then Webb said he would need to review the materials with his client. Linda said of course, and that she would expect a revised proposal within 10 business days. Raymond looked at me once during that silence, just once, a quick look and then away. I did not look away. I held my folder with both hands in my lap, and I met his eyes for as long as he would hold them. He looked away first. The meeting lasted 22 minutes. Outside on the sidewalk, walking back to our cars, Linda said, quietly and without celebration, that went well. Raymond's health had not been good. I knew this from David, who mentioned it neutrally when it came up, careful not to be put in the middle of anything. Raymond had been dealing with elevated blood pressure and some difficulty with his back that had been bothering him for the last 2 years. I held this information without weaponizing it. It was not something I could afford to feel too much about right now. That complicated tenderness you can still feel for someone who has hurt you badly. I set it aside. Not forever. Just for now. There were more immediate things requiring my full attention. October was full of back and forth between the attorneys. Webb revised their offer 3 times. Each revision was closer to Linda's position but still not there. In the meantime, George completed his final report on the marital estate. It was 41 pages long. I read every page. There were numbers in that report I had not known existed 2 years ago, assets I had not known we held, a secondary investment account Raymond had opened in his name alone 11 years earlier that, under North Carolina law, still contained a marital component. Webb's client had not mentioned it in his initial disclosure. George had found it. Linda's expression when she showed me the account documentation was very controlled, but I have been reading faces for 74 years, and I could see what was underneath it. This was significant. This changed our position in a way that could not be minimized or argued around. She explained the legal implications clearly and said that she intended to raise it formally in the next filing. When Webb received that filing, Linda told me later, there had been a pause of several seconds on the phone before he responded. I imagined the pause. I found it quietly satisfying in a way I am not entirely ashamed of. November came and the oak trees in my front yard turned the deep amber gold they always turned in November, and I raked the leaves on a Saturday morning in the thin cold sunshine and thought about all the Novembers I had raked these same leaves and Raymond had been inside watching football. That had always been the division. The yard was mine. The finances were his. It had seemed like a fair trade for decades, and perhaps it had been. But the yard was still here and would be mine in whatever form things settled into, and the finances, it turned out, were also mine in ways he had not planned for. A friend from the library, a woman named Vera who had worked as a cataloger for 30 years before retiring, invited me to join a small group that met on Wednesday evenings at her house. 6 women, she said, ranging in age from 60 to 82, who got together to talk honestly about whatever was happening in their lives over tea and sometimes something stronger. I went once expecting to feel slightly out of place and stayed for 4 months. What I found there was something I had not known I needed. Women who had been through things. Not the same things but things. Who knew what it felt like to be steadier than expected. Vera herself had outlasted a difficult marriage and a bout of cancer in the same decade, and had come through both with a dry wit that I found deeply comforting. There was a woman named Helen who had raised 4 children on her own after her husband died young, and who had opinions about everything and was usually right. There was Dorothy, a retired nurse, who had more practical knowledge about managing difficult situations than anyone I had ever met. These women became something real to me during those winter months. Not a support group in any formal sense. Just women being honest with each other over good tea. In December, Raymond's attorney made what Linda characterized as a significantly improved offer. It was still not fully equitable, but the gap had narrowed considerably. The undisclosed investment account had shifted things. Webb knew we had it. Raymond knew we had it. The question now was whether they wanted to settle or whether they wanted to go to court and have it entered into the formal record in front of a judge. Linda walked me through both paths clearly and without pressure. She told me what each outcome would likely look like. She told me what court would mean in terms of time and exposure and stress. I thought about it for 2 days. Walk. I sat on my back porch in the December cold with a blanket and my tea, and I thought clearly about what I wanted and what I was willing to do to get it. I was not afraid of court. I want to say that plainly. I was 74 years old and I had sat across from difficult situations before, and I was not going to fold simply because the process was uncomfortable. But I was also not interested in dragging this out longer than necessary if an appropriate resolution was possible. What I needed was not to win. It was to be treated fairly.
Thank you for being here. We are halfway through the story, and if you haven't subscribed to this channel, kindly subscribe to this channel because there's more amazing stories upcoming. Let's continue with the story.
I told Linda to go back with our final position. Not a range. Our position. The full, equitable settlement as George's assessment justified it. The house to be sold with proceeds divided according to the marital equity calculation. The retirement accounts divided according to the appropriate formulas. The undisclosed investment account addressed directly and fully. The dissipation of marital funds to be factored in. Linda asked if I was prepared for them to decline and take it to the judge. I am prepared for whatever is necessary, I said. She said she would file the response that afternoon. Christmas that year was quieter than usual. Patricia flew in from Portland and David drove up from Charlotte, and the 3 of us had Christmas at my house. Just us, without the usual extended family gathering that had always centered around Raymond's side. It was strange and small and surprisingly lovely. Patricia made her grandmother's sweet potato casserole and got the proportions slightly wrong in a way that somehow made it taste better. David brought a very good bottle of wine from a vineyard near Charlotte he had discovered. We sat at the dining room table after dinner and talked, really talked, in the way families sometimes manage when things have been stripped back to what is essential. The children did not ask me how I was doing in that careful way people do when they are not sure they want the full answer. They simply talked to me as themselves and I talked to them as myself, and somewhere in the middle of the evening Patricia said, "Mom, you seem all right," and I said, "I am mostly all right," and she said, "Good," and we moved on. That exchange meant more to me than I can easily say. Not the reassurance. The honesty of it. The willingness to say the real thing and receive the real answer and not need it to be more than it was. January brought the formal demand for court proceedings. Webb had declined our final offer. Linda had expected this but wanted to be sure I was not rattled by it. I was not rattled. I had been preparing in some sense, since that August afternoon 2 years ago when I sat at my bedroom desk and looked at the bank statements for the first time. Everything Linda and I and George had done since then had been in preparation for exactly this. Court was simply the next room in a house I had already mapped. I trusted Linda. I trusted the documentation. I showed up to everything on time. The financial deposition was scheduled for mid-February. This was the proceeding where George's full assessment would be formally entered and Raymond and his attorney would have the opportunity to challenge it. Linda prepared me carefully. We went over every figure, every document, every line of George's report. She asked me questions designed to trip me up, not to be unkind but to make sure I could answer clearly under pressure. I had read those 41 pages 4 times. I had asked George questions about every part one did not fully understand. I knew that report the way I had once known the reference collection. Cold. The deposition was held at Linda's office on a gray February morning. Raymond and Webb sat across the table. George presented his findings methodically, and when Webb challenged the classification of the undisclosed investment account, George explained the legal basis for treating it as containing a marital component with a patience that I recognized as the patience of a man who has made this exact argument before and won it before. Webb took careful notes. Raymond looked at the table during the account discussion. I watched him and felt nothing except a kind of distant clarity, the way you feel at the end of a very long journey when the destination is finally visible. After the deposition, walking to the parking deck, Linda said that had gone well. I asked her what well meant in this context. She said that Webb now had the full picture on paper, under oath, and that she expected movement within the next 2 weeks. She was right. Webb called Linda on a Friday afternoon 9 days later with a revised offer. She called me while I was at the watercolor class, and I slipped out into the hallway to take the call, still holding my brush. The new offer was closer. Still not there, but closer. Linda recommended a counter. I agreed. We were nearly at the final station. March came in cold and clear. The watercolor class was doing landscapes that month and I was working on a painting of the view from my back porch, the yard in winter light, the bare dogwood branches, the brown grass, the bird feeder hanging still. Patrice said it had good bones. I was learning that good bones was her highest form of praise. I was learning other things too. About looking at something and really seeing it. About how the light in a painting is not the light itself but your understanding of the light. I found this relevant to more than painting and I was not the only one in that bright room who did. Linda received Webb's final counteroffer on a Tuesday morning in late March. She called me at 10 and I drove to her office and we sat across her desk and she laid it out. It was not our position but it was substantially closer than anything that had come before. She was clear about what it would mean to accept versus what court would realistically achieve. She was not pushing me either way. She was giving me the information. That is what I had always valued about Linda. She treated me like a person capable of making my own decisions rather than someone to be managed toward a predetermined conclusion. I asked her one question. If we go to court, what does Judge Harrington typically do with dissipation findings? Linda was quiet for a moment. She takes them seriously, she said. He nodded. Let's go to court, I said. She did not look surprised. She had, I think, expected this. She said she would file the notice that afternoon, and that the earliest available hearing date was likely to be late April. I drove home in the pale March sunshine and stopped at the grocery store and bought ingredients for soup and spent the rest of the afternoon in the kitchen listening to the radio and letting the good smell of something simmering fill the house. The court date was set for the last week of April. The week before it, Linda and I met twice to go over everything one final time. She walked me through how the morning would proceed. She told me what Webb would likely argue. She told me what to expect from Judge Harrington, who had a reputation for close reading of documentation and for plain-spoken rulings. I was not nervous in the way I had expected to be. What I felt was something more like alertness. The particular focus of being fully present in something that matters. I had a good night's sleep the evening before. I did not expect to, and I did. I arrived at the courthouse on the morning of the 28th in a navy blue coat and my good shoes. Linda was already in the lobby when I arrived. She looked at me and nodded once in the way she had, a small precise acknowledgement. We rode the elevator to the 4th floor and walked down a corridor that smelled of old building and floor polish to Courtroom 4. Raymond and Webb were already seated at the respondents' table when we came in. Raymond was in a dark suit. He looked at me when I entered. I took my seat beside Linda and opened my folder and did not look back at him. The hearing began at 9. Judge Harrington was a compact woman of about 60 with close-cropped silver hair and reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck. She opened the proceedings without ceremony and immediately gave an impression of someone who had read everything in advance and was here to get things done. Webb made his opening argument, characterizing the estate as more modest than our documentation suggested, emphasizing Raymond's contributions to its accumulation over the years, and making the case for the settlement offer his client had already proposed as fair and reasonable. Linda's opening was calm and precise. She walked the court through the documentary record, the full marital estate as George had assessed it, the undisclosed investment account and its history, and then, carefully and clearly, the dissipation finding 14 months of marital funds directed toward the maintenance of an extramarital relationship, documented and dated, the cash withdrawals, the restaurant charges, the hotel receipts that George's investigative accountant had traced and attached to the record. She set it out in the flat, factual language of someone who does not need to raise her voice because the facts themselves are sufficient. Judge Harrington asked several questions. She was thorough. She asked Webb about the undisclosed account directly, and the exchange between them was careful but pointed. She asked George, who was present and had been sworn in, several technical questions about his methodology. George answered with a quiet confidence that came from 20 years of doing this work and knowing it down to its foundations. Raymond sat at his table and once, when the dissipation documentation was being read into the record, I saw his jaw tighten. Webb placed a hand briefly on his arm, a professional steadying gesture. I recognized the motion. Linda concluded by noting that my client had come to these proceedings not to punish but to be treated equitably, that the documentation demonstrated a clear and significant departure from equitable behavior during the marital period, and that the settlement offer previously proposed by the respondent did not come close to reflecting the full picture of the marital estate. She said it without heat, without theater, in the voice of someone who has done her preparation and is simply reporting what the preparation found. I sat beside her with my folder and felt, for the first time in a long time, completely at rest. Webb's rebuttal focused on characterizing our dissipation argument as overreach, suggesting that the funds in question had been used for personal expenditures of a modest and ordinary nature, that the undisclosed account had been a simple oversight in the initial disclosure rather than intentional concealment, and that his client had made a good faith offer that reflected his sincere desire to resolve matters fairly. Judge Harrington looked at him over her reading glasses during the oversight characterization and said nothing for a moment. The silence was brief and entirely eloquent. Webb continued without acknowledging it, but I do not think he could have missed it. She said she would issue her ruling within 3 weeks. We were adjourned. In the elevator going down, Linda said only, "That was a good morning." I agreed that it had been. On the front steps of the courthouse in the April sun, I called Constance. She picked up immediately. She said she had been thinking about me all morning. I told her it had gone well. She said she had always known it would. Then she said, "Lunch?" Said yes. We met at the bakery on Main Street, the same one where she had given me Linda's name almost 2 years before, and we had sandwiches and good coffee and talked about other things entirely. The ruling came in 18 days. Linda called on a Wednesday afternoon. I was in the backyard checking on the early bulbs, the daffodils pushing up along the fence line where I had planted them in October. I pulled off one gardening glove and answered. Judge Harrington had ruled for equitable distribution weighted substantially in my favor. The house on Blue Ridge Avenue was to be sold. Proceeds split 62% to me and 38% to Raymond. At the appraised value of $712,000, that meant approximately $441,000 to me. Not the $160,000 Raymond had offered last January. The investment accounts were to be divided 57% to me and 43% to Raymond, the dissipation finding cited as a significant factor. The undisclosed investment account was to be divided according to the full marital component George had calculated. My own inheritance from my aunt, held in accounts in my name alone and documented as separate property throughout the proceedings, remained entirely mine and untouched. Raymond's pension was subject to a qualified domestic relations order granting me 36% of the marital portion. In total, the ruling represented more than 3 times what Raymond had offered me in his first proposal 11 months ago. I sat down on the garden bench with the phone in my hand. The daffodils were pushing up yellow along the fence. The early light was the particular clean gold of late April, when everything is just beginning and has not yet had to prove itself. I stayed there for a while. Then I called Patricia. She answered on the first ring. I told her. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, in a voice that was working very hard to be steady, "Mom." "I know," I said. She started to cry a little, which made me start to cry a little, which is how it should be. Then she said, "I am coming next weekend," and I said, "Please do." Webb filed a motion to reconsider 2 weeks later, arguing that the dissipation finding had been given disproportionate weight in the ruling. Judge Harrington denied it in under a week, in language that was brief and final in the way of rulings that do not anticipate further discussion. There was one additional attempt on Raymond's part to revisit the QDRO calculation through a second attorney brought in briefly for that purpose. Linda responded that her client had participated throughout in good faith, had received a clear ruling, and that there was nothing to revisit. That ended it. The house sold in June. It was on the market for 8 days. The oak trees in the front yard were in full leaf, and the garden I had tended for 23 years was at its summer peak. Roses and dahlias and the old hydrangeas along the south wall, and apparently the garden was mentioned specifically in the listing notes as a feature. I signed the closing documents with the pen my library colleagues had given me when I retired, a good solid pen with my name on it. It felt like the right pen for the occasion. Raymond had signed in a separate appointment earlier that morning. We were not in the same room. What I felt at the closing was not what I had imagined I would feel during those long winter nights when I had sometimes let myself think ahead to this moment. I had imagined something triumphant and sharpened. What I actually felt was quieter than that. Something settling. Something coming back into balance after a long and uncomfortable tipping. The word that came to me, sitting in that closing office with a pen in my hand and the documents in front of me, was restored. Not victorious. Restored. As if the rightful order of things had been, through a great deal of careful work, returned to its proper alignment. Linda's fees were paid. George Hadley's fees were paid. I wrote Constance a handwritten letter, not a card, a real letter, because she had been the first person who had told me to take myself seriously, and that had mattered more than she would ever fully know. I also wrote to Vera, whose Wednesday evening group had given me something essential during those months, a place to be honestly oneself among women who understood what that took. Both letters took me 2 drafts each, and I was glad to write them. Some things deserve the effort of a real letter. I had already found my new place before the house closed. A ground-floor condominium on the northern edge of Hendersonville. 2 bedrooms, good light. A private courtyard in the back that got the morning sun from about 9 o'clock until noon, which is the best sun for reading. No large yard to maintain. No wraparound expectations built into every corner. I bought it outright. I planted deep pink climbing roses along the courtyard railing, and the following spring they bloomed exactly as I had hoped, with a particular stubbornness of roses that have decided they belong somewhere. The first gathering I hosted at the new place was in August. Constance and Vera and Dorothy and Helen from the Wednesday group, Patricia, who had come for a long weekend, David and his wife and the children including 4-year-old Poppy, who was now 5 and had opinions about everything. My neighbor from across the courtyard, a retired schoolteacher named Margaret, who had moved in the same month I did, and with whom I had developed an immediate understanding over shared coffee and a mutual appreciation for quiet mornings. The table was too small and we ate in 2 sittings, and it was completely perfect. I was teaching again. The library had asked me to lead a reading group for older adults on Thursday mornings, and I had said yes without hesitation. 8 participants, ranging from 67 to 88, and we read whatever we wanted and argued about it with great enthusiasm. One of the women, a 91-pound force of nature named Louise who had grown up in rural Appalachia and had learned to read at 43, talked about books with an intensity that made everything she said worth listening to carefully. I had missed teaching more than I had known. I had let it go quietly, and now I was taking it back. The watercolor class continued on Tuesday afternoons. I finished my painting of the winter backyard, and Patrice said it was ready to frame. I framed it and hung it in the entrance hall of my new place where I could see it every time I came through the door. A painting of a place I had left, done in a color I had learned that year, hanging in a space that was entirely and only mine. I liked what that meant. I thought about it sometimes when I came in from a walk, keys in hand, the morning sun from the courtyard coming through the glass panel in the door. As for Raymond and Melissa, small towns have a way of circulating information without anyone having to try. They had moved into a rental near the center of town after the house sold. By autumn, things between them were, by all accounts, not easy. Melissa had entered the relationship with a particular idea of what it would look like, the stability and comfort of a settled life with a man of means and experience. What she found was a man in his mid-70s whose financial situation had been significantly reshaped by a court ruling he had not anticipated, renting a 2-bedroom apartment, dealing with a difficult back. The restaurant dinners and weekend trips are one thing in the beginning of something. The ordinary Tuesday mornings are another thing entirely. By the following spring, I heard from David, who heard from Raymond's nephew, that Melissa had moved out. I felt nothing dramatic about this. I felt a kind of quiet recognition, the same recognition I had felt at the closing table. The life Raymond had dismantled hours to pursue had not been the life he had imagined. That is not unusual. People often discover that what they have traded for something was worth more than what they got. That is a difficult thing to learn at 75. Raymond's health was not good, David mentioned once, carefully looking at his plate. I received this with the complex feeling it deserved. 75 years old with a difficult back and a reduced financial picture and a diminished life. I was 74. I walked 2 miles most mornings. I had my reading group on Thursdays and my watercolor class on Tuesdays and Constance for coffee every week and Vera's group when I wanted it and Patricia's calls every Sunday evening and Poppy who had started calling me Grandma Ellie and called at random moments to tell me about things that had happened at kindergarten. What is a good life? It is not always the life that looks impressive from outside. It is the one that feels true from inside. The roses bloomed in my courtyard the following April, deep pink and completely reliable. I stood with my coffee in the morning light and watched the first ones open and thought, this is mine. I had built it. Not the first time I had helped build something with another person that had been real for a long time and then had ended. But this time entirely and only mine, built from what had survived and what I had learned and what I had quietly prepared for when it mattered most. And that is the story I wanted you to have. The lesson is this: know your own life. Not just the rooms of it that feel comfortable and familiar, but all of it. What is yours? What you built? What you are owed? Preparation is not cynicism. It is self-knowledge applied to reality. And the quiet ones, the ones who have been watching and listening and taking notes for decades, we are very rarely as unprepared as anyone expected. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. I would love to know what you took from this. Leave a comment below and tell me which city you are listening from.